first, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on this webcast. I'm pretty excited to have the opportunity to hear from Nathan on anything, but especially around identity management. Because what I find when I work with Office 365 customers, identity management is sort of the unspoken requirement. Microsoft likes to talk a lot about mail in Office 365. They see that as a gateway drug or the easy way to get people into the flow of using Office 365. But what they don't tell you is that under the surface are all these requirements for having DirSync, password hash sync, identity federation, and so on. So in the body of the presentation in a minute, Nathan is going to walk through some of the concerns and issues that people such as yourselves are running into. Before we do that, I want to just say a quick word. I'm brand new to the CTO role at eNow. I've been here not quite a month yet. Really excited about it. I joined eNow because of their leadership position in the monitoring space, especially as it regards monitoring Office 365. If you're not already an Office 365 customer, then you may not recognize what our customers such as Facebook, the National Basketball Association, M&T Bank, what these guys are finding is that Microsoft wants to run the service as a black box. They don't necessarily have a lot of interest in telling people what's happening in the service or what the quality of service is or when they have outages or downtime. So if that's important to your business, if you need to know that, you're going to have to make your own arrangements to find that out, and that's kind of what we specialize in. So I want to make sure Nathan has plenty of time for his presentation, so I'm going to bow out and go on mute and let him take it away. So Nathan, it's all yours.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's great to see you joining eNow.
Thanks.
Great group of guys over there. Jay's a lovely guy who's been close to our Exchange community for a while, and obviously Van Hornbeek and yourself been guys that I've known for a few years. So it's awesome to see you on the team, and I guess welcome. Anyway, I am going to move forward here. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, children of all ages. I am Nathan O'Brien. I'm going to be talking about identity and authentication management for Office 365 over the next hour or so. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those up in the chat. I will attempt to address them as I can while I'm talking. If, Paul, while you're on mute there, you see anything that or you have any questions yourself that really stand out, feel free to jump in and interrupt me. I may not be able to get to everything immediately in the chat because, I'm going to be busy talking and stuff. It's hard to read and talk at the same time. But absolutely, I'm going to leave a few minutes at the end of the call where I will address any questions that I can. And I understand the people at eNow are going to be kind enough to give away a couple copies of Office 365 for Exchange professionals. An excellent resource on Office 365. It's actually becoming more than just Exchange stuff now. Tony Redman, Michael Van Hornbeek, Paul Cunningham, and then my coworker Jeff Guillet put that book together. It's an awesome resource, so everybody stick around for that, and they're going to give away a couple copies of that. So let's get started. There we go. Oh, there's a slide. Ask and win. Please save your questions for the. Don't save your questions for the end. Go ahead, throw them up in the chat at any point. I will try to answer them again as we go along if I can. If not, I'll get to them at the end. Anyway, we're going to give away a couple copies of that. So awesome. All right. So as Paul said at the top there, Office 365 is really an excellent product, and there's a lot of really great things about it. But there is kind of a lot of hidden complexity there as well in your Office 365 deployments. And for me, working with customers deploying Office 365 over the last 4.5, coming close to 5 years now, I find that identity and authentication management is one of those real fundamental pieces that you really have to get right from the beginning in order to have a successful Office 365 deployment. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Microsoft wants Office 365 to be a viable platform for everybody in the world, all organizations. And in order to do that, they have built really quite a lot of options into the identity and authentication management for Office 365. That's great, but all these different options and possible configurations cause quite a lot of complexity in the service. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to clearly go through a whole bunch of these options, make everything nice and clear. So hopefully you all, as you move into Office 365 or manage your existing deployments, have good success. One thing that I do want to add before I get started is that Office 365 moves incredibly fast. There are hundreds of updates to Office 365 every year. This is actually a deck that I've used several times in the last few years, and just for today I made a whole bunch of changes to stuff. So if you're with us here live on the presentation, good. If you're listening to this recorded, some of this information may be dated. Stuff changes fairly quickly. But let's get started. So we're going to start off talking about ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, and why you would deploy ADFS in support of your Office 365 deployments. ADFS does provide single sign-on. I put that SSO in quotes there for a reason. We're going to talk about that more on the next slide, what single sign-on means and what it doesn't mean within Office 365. ADFS allows you to control your account policies. Originally, when Office 365 was made available, there was very limited account policies that you could control within Azure Active Directory. As the service evolves, there is certainly more control that you have. You can set passwords to not expire for your users now without ADFS, that sort of thing. But certainly, deploying ADFS means that your users are authenticating against your Active Directory, and you have complete control over those password policies. Whereas if you're not using ADFS, then you're using Azure Active Directory, where some of the account control features that you're used to may not be available to you. ADFS originally, again, when deploying Office 365 first came out, it allowed you to do multi-factor authentication through third-party tools integrating with ADFS. While that's still the case, there is now multi-factor authentication that's available within Office 365 through an acquisition that Microsoft made, the Phone Factor platform. There are some limitations to that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Some reasons why you may want to go with a third-party integrated ADFS multi-factor authentication solution. Claims rules is another reason why you may want to deploy ADFS. Claims rules are authentication rules that when you log in allow you to control the circumstances under which some of your users may or may not authenticate into the service. I think we talk about this again in a couple slides. I think the most common reason I've had to implement claims rules was to control that users can only log in from the corporate resources, from the corporate site, and not from home. With Office 365, that may be an issue for some organizations. And then sign-in auditing and the ability to immediately disable accounts. The current version of ADFS does not have awesome logging and auditing abilities, but there is some there that gives you more visibility into your auditing of when users are logging into Office 365 than you get with just Azure Active Directory. The next version of ADFS that we're going to talk about does have much better auditing available to you. And then the final reason I think that you'd want to deploy ADFS is to allow authentication with other applications. ADFS doesn't just work for Microsoft applications, but it certainly can work for a lot of other third-party applications. We'll say Salesforce, for example. You can use ADFS to authenticate into Salesforce. So let's move on, talk a little bit more about that single sign-on experience. ADFS, the big selling point Microsoft always stresses with deploying ADFS is single sign-on, but they don't really, when they do that, they don't really get into the fine print that there's a number of different authentication experiences that you may get or that you will get with different clients. The web client, so logging into portal.office.com or however you're accessing that Office 365 web portal, you can get fairly close to a single sign-on experience. The user will actually need to put in their username. You go to portal.office.com, you'll have to type in your username. Should typically be your email address. And from there, on a domain-joined workstation on the internal network. As long as ADFS is in the trusted zone in Internet Explorer, you won't have to type in your password on that workstation. You can set up a smart link for your users. Actually, there's a way to provide a link to your users that they could click on and go directly in without having to do any of that. I believe there's a link in the notes to this slide that gives more detail on how you could configure that if you wanted. And on Windows 10 Azure AD joined PCs, you can get that single sign-on experience into Office 365 web applications without ADFS at all. But that's only on Windows 10 workstations that are Azure Active Directory joined. The applications that give you actual single sign-on are those that have a rich client. The rich client authentication is real live single sign-on experience. You just type in your password once when you're logging into the workstation, and then you don't have to do that again to access the application. Unfortunately, that's limited to, in Office 365, 2 applications. The Skype for Business and CRM Online clients will give you real live single sign-on, but unfortunately, it's not been available to any other clients. Outlook, which is a basic proxy auth application, does not give single sign-on. You actually have to type in your username and password into that basic authentication prompt and then select remember my credentials for Outlook. There is some modification to that I'm going to talk about when we get to modern authentication, but for now, the basic Outlook authentication story is you don't get single sign-on, even with ADFS. So there are actually 2 different versions of ADFS that we currently could be using, ADFS 2.1 and ADFS 3.0. ADFS 2.1 would be available with Windows Server 2008 R2 as an additional download. It is not the version of ADFS that's included in a role of Server 2008 R2. That's actually ADFS 2.0. That does not work with Office 365. 3.0 came out with Server 2012 R2. There's some new features to that I'm going to go over here. It's not dependent on IIS, so you don't have to have IIS deployed on that ADFS server. It's got this responsive design for multiple form factors, which basically means the forms-based authentication logon page looks good on your PC and on your phone and on your tablet, those different form factors. It does have support for changing passwords on the ADFS site, on the ADFS forms-based authentication page there, but you have to deploy workplace join as well for that to work. And then you can do login page customization through some PowerShell commands. You could, of course, customize the login page for ADFS 2.1, but that was, you had to be a web designer. You had to go into web.config files and actually, do HTML work. With ADFS 3.0, there's some simple PowerShell commands that you can do to change all that customization that you see up there on the page. There's a link in the notes to this slide that contain information on how to do all that. The next version of ADFS that will be available with Server 2016 or Server 10, whatever they end up calling that. There are some snazzy new features to that version of ADFS, so we're going to talk about real briefly. You can authenticate users from non-Active Directory directories, so non-AD directories, LDAP, SQL directories. You could authenticate through ADFS using this new version of ADFS. Access control policies are kind of the evolution of claims rules. Claims rules, as we talked about real briefly, and we're going to hit on more in a couple slides, are a way that you can control who can authenticate and when. With the next version of ADFS, we have a much better, more granular control of that in a GUI-based interface that looks kind of like group policy objects. So that's a good evolution there in that next version of ADFS. The update process for updating your ADFS farm from 2.1 to 3.0 was basically you had to build an entire new ADFS farm. With the update from ADFS 3.0 into the next version, whatever they call that, is more like updating your domain. You'll be able to add in a new version, the next version ADFS server, into that farm. And then once you have all the servers replaced and updated in that farm, add one, remove one until everything's all the next version, then you'll be able to do a domain, basically an ADFS farm uplift, and then turn on all the new functionality of the next version of ADFS. It also does have improved logging and auditing. It records a lot more of the information that's going on better than the current version of ADFS. Alternate login IDs. So when using ADFS, certainly the recommendation is that all your users, you set the UPN to match their primary email address, and then you tell users to log in with essentially their UPN to all Office 365 resources. Some organizations, because maybe the UPN is being used for another application, are not able to do that. When you can't do that, you can change and use an alternate login ID. So instead of UPN, you can set ADFS to authenticate against your primary SMTP address. So you can have a different UPN and still authenticate against that. There's 4 main steps to that. Those 4 steps make it look fairly easy, but it is a little bit more complex than that. That's kind of high level. That covers it. Especially updating that claims rule can be a little bit tricky. I would not do this unless you have to. But if you do, those are the procedures. And it used to be for a very long time that alternate login IDs was not supported with Exchange Hybrid. But as of very recently, in the last month or 2, I believe, the Exchange support team is now supporting. You can do alternate login IDs with Exchange Hybrid. Still wouldn't do it if you don't have to, but you can if you need to. Multi-factor authentication. As we mentioned, originally the only way to do multi-factor authentication with Office 365 was to deploy ADFS and then set up something like RSA tokens and integrate that with your ADFS server. Now that phone factor, multi-factor authentication is available within Office 365, phone factor MFA is not great yet. We still need some improvements to modern authentication before that will be universally usable across the service. There are some places where it works, some places where it doesn't. Definitely investigate that before you turn that on. There's, again, links in the slide that give you more information there. ADFS 3.0 does support Workplace Join, which is a Server 2012 R2 feature that allows you to use your workstation as kind of that second factor for multi-factor authentication. And as I said, Outlook doesn't support multi-factor authentication without modern authentication, which we're going to talk about in a slide or 2. So Outlook, if you turn on multi-factor authentication without setting up modern authentication, then you'll get an app password for Outlook, which is really kind of a pain. It's not a great experience. Modern authentication is a new feature that's going to be turned on here, it's available within Office 365 currently, but you have to manually turn it on for each tenant. It will allow multi-factor authentication to work for Outlook 2016 or Outlook 2013 Service Pack 1 or better with several updates. You're going to be on the current update for that to get that modern authentication to work. It does allow for that phone factor, multi-factor authentication to work within Outlook, so you can have MFA, but there are still some instances where the multi-factor authentication doesn't work within Office 365. It currently doesn't work on the Skype for Business client. That's kind of a pain. And within PowerShell, it does work for remote PowerShell for Azure Active Directory, but it doesn't work in remote PowerShell for Link Exchange or SharePoint. So I wouldn't go with modern authentication just yet, unless you have a real compelling reason and you know what you're doing. For most Office 365 customers, I would avoid that. The ADFS proxy is, or Windows Application Proxy, is a security role of ADFS that allows you to put that ADFS proxy in the DMZ so that you're not exposing your authentication server directly to the internet. I know a number of organizations that I've worked with have had the requirement that they not do that. So the ADFS proxy you can put in the DMZ. It's more secure that way. The proxy provides that forms-based authentication login for your external users. Then the ADFS server can provide that Windows integrated authentication for your internal users, which gives you kind of the complete authentication experience into Office 365 as it's designed. If you don't do an ADFS proxy server in your DMZ, then you have to make the choice to have your ADFS server either by default do that Windows integrated authentication first or do forms-based authentication first, which, depending on where your clients are, will give a less than complete authentication experience, I guess. So the best way is to have that ADFS proxy or Windows application proxy in the DMZ. There are some hardware load balancers, F5 in particular, that can replace that ADFS proxy, gives you all the functionality of that. That is, of course, not free. It's kind of spendy, but if your organization has that capability, there is a plug-in for F5 that does that. I believe there's some other hardware load balancers as well that can do that, but I'm not going to list them all. And then Windows Application Proxy replaces the ADFS proxy for ADFS 3.0. It's a role of Windows Server 2012 R2, and it also replaces some of the TMG, Threat Management Gateway functionality for that deprecated product. Sizing and securing your ADFS servers. So an ADFS farm, by default with the Windows internal database, can have 5 ADFS servers as members of that farm. If you're going over 5, then you're going to need to use a SQL database for that farm. You can split those ADFS servers, those 5 members of that farm, between 2 sites. That will work with the Windows integrated database. Works well, but in larger deployments, you want to consider using SQL and its high availability options for the configuration database for ADFS. The ADFS capacity planning worksheet, there's a link to it in the notes for this slide. You can use that to size your ADFS deployments. Typically, most Office 365 customers under about 5,000 users, sizing ADFS isn't a terrible concern. A single ADFS server will work just fine. But if you're going over that, then you may want to size your ADFS servers. Make sure you have enough capacity to support your user authentication requests. And securing your ADFS servers, it does, when you deploy ADFS, either version, the security configuration wizard extensions are created for you so that you can use that scwcmd.exe command line tool to run the security configuration wizard against those ADFS servers and get them all nice and hardened and good security on them. The high availability options for ADFS are always a bit of a concern, especially for smaller companies moving to Office 365. When you deploy that ADFS server or servers, it becomes your authentication authority for Office 365. So if those servers go offline, they're not available, then your users aren't going to be able to authenticate into Office 365, which is never a good thing. So the default kind of high availability for ADFS would be 2 ADFS servers plus those 2 ADFS proxy servers, and each of those needs at least 1 hardware load balancer. So kind of gets into a lot of hardware, 4 servers and at least 2 hardware load balancers just for ADFS. If we're talking about a small organization with 1 or 2 Exchange servers moving to Office 365, doesn't always make sense to get rid of 2 Exchange servers and replace it with 4 ADFS servers and several load balancers. You can, of course, skip those ADFS proxy servers. They're not required. That cuts down on the load a little bit, on the server requirements a little bit, and you can use SQL for that ADFS database, as we talked about, SQL Standard or Enterprise Edition, which will give you the replication of that database across sites. Again, not required, but it is an option that you can consider. When deploying ADFS, most organizations, certainly nearly all the organizations that I've deployed, decide to virtualize their ADFS servers. That gives you the ability, to vMotion those servers to other hardware, recover them more easily. That gives you better high availability than just, the one ADFS server if you decide to go that route. You certainly can deploy ADFS to either first or third-party hosting situations, either Azure or something like AWS, Amazon Web Services, that sort of thing. When you do that, you're going to want to deploy a domain controller with your ADFS server in Azure or Amazon. Obviously, the ADFS server needs a domain controller to authenticate against, so it doesn't make any sense to deploy an ADFS server without a domain controller right next to it in Azure or wherever you're deploying that. And it is important to note that to meet the Azure, specifically SLAs with ADFS, you do need to deploy availability sets for your ADFS server. So you're going to be deploying a number of ADFS servers in the availability sets, and your domain controller is going to have to be in that availability set. So you can't just deploy one ADFS server in Azure and have it meet those SLAs for high availability. You do have to do a bit of deployment there. Claims, as we talked about, are statements made by the user logging in that's understood by ADFS to allow authentication in specific scenarios. Again, the most common scenario that I've deployed claims for is an organization that has hourly based users that they want to ensure can only authenticate into Office 365 while they're at work, so they can't go home, log into their email and say they need to be paid hourly for that time that they were working on email at home. So we can do that via claims rules. The process of setting up and configuring claims rules is fairly complex. There's a number of links in the notes to this slide that go through that for you. I definitely wouldn't do it unless you absolutely have to. Claims rules are, they're easy to mess up. The access control policies in the next version of ADFS will be much better. One thing to remember that when you're deploying claims rules is that all claims rules are read every time that user logs on, and the last applicable claims rules is the one that apply. So if I have 3 claims rules that apply to Paul as he logs into Office 365, the first one says he can log on, second one says he can't log on, and the third one says he can. The result of that is going to be the last claims rule that's read, which is going to allow him to log on. Maybe I didn't want him to because of that one rule that says he can't, but it's going to be overridden by the last claims rule that applies to him. Troubleshooting ADFS. Talk real briefly about some troubleshooting steps you can go through if you have issues with your ADFS deployment. There's two links to the metadata endpoints for ADFS. You want to verify that those work. You copy and paste those into a browser with your ADFS server in that hostname section. You should get back an XML page that tells you that ADFS is available and functional. You want to confirm that SPN. Set SPN command is listed there. We'll confirm that SPN is properly created in your Active Directory and available. You want to make sure that your certificate on the ADFS servers is valid, functions, the whole chain is there and everything works. Then there is an event viewer debug log that you can look into, and there is an ADFS troubleshooting guide. It's linked in the notes for this slide. Pretty much wraps up, recovering ADFS from failure, right. So if your ADFS farm does go down for whatever reason, there are some things you can do to recover from that failure. First command up there, convert MSOL domain to standard, will tell your Office 365 tenant not to use ADFS anymore. That is you're gonna have to set passwords on all your users. That's kind of a lengthy process. It's not necessarily immediate. There's a couple PowerShell commands you can run that'll get that going, but it's not going to recover you immediately from your ADFS failure. Then you can go ahead and rebuild your ADFS servers and update MSOL federated domain run from the new rebuilt ADFS servers. Will tell Office 365 these are the ADFS servers that you want to use, and we'll make them functional again there. So that wraps up the ADFS section. Now we're going to move on to directory synchronization tools. Directory synchronization is obviously the process of copying your on-premises user accounts from Active Directory into Azure Active Directory so that those accounts can be used with Office 365. The directory synchronization story has actually become fairly complex. There's quite a lot of tools that are still available for you to use for this. We started off with DirSync. That was the original default. Works good. They have made some improvements and some more functionality available in newer tools. But in many Office 365 tenants, I believe DirSync is still, if you go into that identity management section, I believe it still links to DirSync in most Office 365 tenants. Reasons for that is because Azure Active Directory Connect still has some very high or much higher resource requirements than DirSync. So the current tool that you should be using, Azure Active Directory Connect, you can use that if you can, but if you don't have the server horsepower to run that, you may want to fall back to DirSync. Additionally, you can use Microsoft Information Manager, which is the newest version of Forefront Identity Manager, the upgraded version. That's it does a lot more than just this directory synchronization process. There's a lot of other functionality it has for you, but if you need that, you certainly can use that server. One thing that I think is really interesting about MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager, is the licensing model. I think we'll find that this is the model that Microsoft is going to go to for a lot of their products. If you look, there is no charge for the Microsoft Information Manager server itself, but your users need a client access license. And that client access license, Microsoft would want you to purchase that via Azure Active Directory Premium. So buy Azure Active Directory Premium, I think it's about $6 a month per user, and then you get that Microsoft Identity Manager functionality included as part of that suite. Overview of Azure Active Directory Connect. It's a light version of Microsoft Identity Manager. Actually, I believe it's still the case that Azure Active Directory Connect has a slightly newer and updated version of the sync engine from what's currently in Microsoft Identity Manager. So AAD Connect is actually a little newer product than MIM itself. Features of AAD Connect, Microsoft likes to tout that 4-click setup. You certainly can deploy Azure Active Directory Connect with that 4-click. I'm not a real big fan of advertising that because there's a lot of features in there, and really you should understand AAD Connect better than just clicking 4 times before you deploy it. But Microsoft likes to tout it as such. AAD Connect does give you that full shared GAL within Exchange Online Hybrid, so all users on premises and in Active Directory see the same global address list. It does sync your security groups, distribution lists. It syncs the on-premises Active Directory photos into Azure Active Directory. That's the small 64 by 64 photos, not the large high-resolution photos that you can store in Exchange 2013 and better. It does all proxies for mail-enabled users and contacts are retained. It allows for that free busy coexistence. And Azure Active Directory Connect can now configure ADFS for you. You still have to deploy the ADFS servers, have that deployed and set and installed, but AAD Connect can do the configuration of ADFS for you if you so desire. Reasons to deploy AAD Connect. It's required for hybrid and staged migrations. You have to have that directory synchronization set up, and it allows for identity federation. AAD Connect specifically has a couple of additional features that allows you to use. It allows group write-back, password write-back from Office 365 into your on-premises Active Directory. So there are some additional features of AAD Connect that does give you additional functionality. It's nice to have. You used to have to deploy like Forefront Identity Manager for multi-forest connections to Office 365, but AAD Connect does support that now. We'll talk about those in a little bit. The sync process for AAD Connect, that server first connects to your on-premises Active Directory, downloads all the user and most of their attributes, 150 some attributes into its database. Does the same thing to Azure Active Directory and downloads all that. It compares those two sets, and then it syncs the delta, just the changes each time, into Office 365, Azure Active Directory for you. It's based on the object GUID, so it uses that object GUID as the source anchor, we call it, to ensure that all the objects might match up. And then optionally, there are, I think, about 10 Active Directory attributes that AAD Connect can write back currently on premises into your Active Directory. Those are mostly to support things like unified messaging. You can filter users in AAD Connect. There you have two options. You can either filter by OU, or you can filter them by Active Directory attribute. I find that filtering by OU is preferable in almost all cases, makes everything much easier. Originally, this filtering wasn't allowed, wasn't supported in Office 365 because there was no soft delete function for Exchange Online mailboxes. So if you moved a user out of the filtering, it would hard delete their mailbox, and then Microsoft was unable to recover those, and that was a bit of an issue. Once they got the soft delete function working within Office 365, then they were able to support this filtering. So that's available for you. And again, can be done by OU or Active Directory attribute, but OU is much preferable in my opinion. When you do an Azure Active Directory Connect sync, in order to create that unified global address list, it needs to actually look at what type of object is in on-premises and in Office 365 and sync those objects accordingly. For instance, if you have an on-premises mailbox, then the object it creates for you in Azure Active Directory can't also be a mailbox attribute. It has to be a mail-enabled contact so that users in Office 365 can email to that contact, which will then be forwarded into your on-premises mailbox. Vice versa on-premises, if you have a Office 365 mailbox, you can't have a mailbox object within the on-premises Active Directory. So there's 17 different recipient types in Exchange 2013, and AAD Connect, when it does that sync for you, it sorts out and makes sure that all the correct object types are created on premises and in Office 365 as necessary. The process for installing AAD Connect is fairly straightforward. Again, if you're just looking for those basic options, it's a fairly simple 4-click setup. You just hit next a couple times. You have to supply a couple of accounts, an on-premises admin account and an Office 365 admin account. And from there, it provisions all the permissions it needs, keeps everything working, and gets the sync process going for you. It is important that you keep up with new versions. AAD Connect hopefully will be the last software. They went with DirSync, then another Azure Active Directory sync tool for a short time. Now they're on AAD Connect, but hopefully we'll keep up with the proper versions here of AAD Connect, and that is an in-place upgrade for new versions of AAD Connect going forward. And to force a manual sync, the process has changed a number of times as we've gone through these different tools. But currently, with AAD Connect, it runs a scheduled task. So you can just go into the task manager, scheduled task manager on your AAD Connect server and manually kick that off if you need to force a manual sync. Some of the older versions had much more complex and confusing processes to kick off that manual sync, but now it's fairly simplified. After you install AAD Connect, it's certainly not recommended that you create your users directly in the Office 365 portal. If you're using your on-premises Active Directory as a source of authority for Office 365 accounts, then you need to create all your users on-premises. You don't have to create them with a mailbox and migrate them. You can create them as remote mailboxes on-premises, but you do have to create those accounts on-premises. So don't create the users in the portal. And that sync process does not assign licenses to users, so you do have to separately go in and assign Office 365 licenses to each of your users after they're created and synced up into Office 365. There on the screen you see the remote PowerShell command for Azure Active Directory PowerShell to get all unlicensed users and then assign a usage location, and then you can assign a specific SKU Office 365 license to all those users. There's more you can do with that, but we'll let you work out those PowerShell communications, those PowerShell commands. So what will and will not sync, as you see there on the left, it syncs all users, mail-enabled contacts, mail-enabled groups, and passwords if you configure it to sync passwords. On the right-hand side, you can see a list of things that won't sync. Built-in admin groups, mail-enabled public folders won't sync by default. You have to take care of that. Exchange system, mailbox accounts, any objects ending with MSOL, and anything that meets those default FIM filters is not going to sync by default. The password sync gives you that same sign-on experience as opposed to the single sign-on experience. So users will use their same username, but then they'll use the same password if you set up password sync. That is not single sign-on, but they use the same password, so it's a good enough feature for for many organizations, I think, especially if they don't want to deploy those additional ADFS servers or be dependent on keeping those servers up on premises. They are double hashed passwords that are copied to Windows Azure Active Directory, and those Azure Active Directory passwords may not expire. By default, they don't expire. So if you have an on-premises password that's copied up via password hash, it expires on-premises. It will not expire in Office 365 by default. That password sync process occurs every 2 minutes. Password write-back is a new feature enabled by Azure Active Directory that you can change your password, or Azure Active Directory Connect. You can change your password in Azure Active Directory. As long as you have that Azure Active Directory Premium license, then that password can be written back into your on-premises Active Directory, and then even used with ADFS. Does support resetting password for users using password sync, and it will enforce all your on-premises password policies that as the users are changing those passwords in Office 365. You can use password sync as a backup to ADFS, and this is something I've done with a number of customers. You still deploy ADFS and configure, convert MSOL domain to federated so that their normally users are logging in with ADFS, but leave that password sync running in the background, and then when or if you have an issue where ADFS servers aren't available, you can run some fairly simple PowerShell commands to convert that authentication back to using those passwords. back to using those synced passwords, and then figure out your ADFS issue and go forward from there. A couple questions. It's a pretty long one. I'll get to that in a minute here. Just about done. I'm going to open it up and go through questions here in a couple slides. So troubleshooting your sync. If you have sync issues with your directory sync service, couple things you can do to troubleshoot those. First of all, ID Fix. Highly recommend everybody run ID Fix before turning on and deploying your Azure Active Directory Connect or DirSync server. That program will go through your Active Directory, and it will point out any issues that you're going to have. Point out things like address conflicts that aren't going to sync up, any illegal characters. You can use on premises, for instance, you can use the ampersand in your account where that wouldn't be allowed in Azure Active Directory, so it'll point out when that sort of thing happens. It's a brand new service, Azure Active Directory Connect Health for Sync. I haven't had an opportunity to test this out yet. I believe it was just released in public preview. It's not even fully GA supported yet, but it's kind of a monitoring tool for your Azure Active Directory Connect server. I think eNow's monitoring tools are a bit better and more comprehensive, but at least this Azure Active Directory Connect Health gives you something if you're going that way. Accidental deletion protection is a feature that they've added to this Azure Active Directory Connect that you can configure to only sync so many deletes per sync cycle. So if you configure it, for instance, to only sync 10, then for some reason somebody deletes 11 accounts, it will not sync those changes in that delete cycle, in that sync cycle, and you'll have to manually sync those if you want those to go. I've seen that save a couple of customers from issues. If you can't do the initial sync for your deployment, AAD Connect, often caused by password problems or issues in the setup where all the accounts weren't created correctly and synced. You do need to verify that you have all the right accepted domains set up. Verify that the user's UPNs or other source anchor, if you're using alternate ID, is fully functional. And then to force that sync again in Azure Active Directory Connect, you can do that via scheduled task. There's a scheduled task that's created there, just run as, but in the older versions there are various ways to kick off that manual sync. And then you can go into the MIIS client and you can verify that that sync server is syncing what you expect it to be syncing, and it's all working properly. So that's, we got about 10 more minutes for questions. I'm going to go back and look at some of these questions here, but talked about ADFS and Azure Active Directory Connect. So any questions anybody has, let's go ahead and shoot. I see there's some stuff there in the chat, so I'm going to go back up to the top. Let's see. Jason had a question. We're in the middle of a hybrid migration. We have almost 1,200 mailbox stage, 6,500 more to go. We want to upgrade DirSync to AAD Connect, but we're wondering if that would be okay with the staged mailboxes that are currently incrementally syncing. Also, will the upgrade give you the choice to switch to SQL for database, and do you recommend doing so if you're only syncing 20,000 options? So I would not switch while you have staged objects. I would get those, make sure everybody's either fully in Office 365 or on premises before you switch from DirSync to AAD Connect. But once that's done, I don't see any issue with upgrading that DirSync to AAD Connect. And would I use SQL for 20,000 objects? No, I probably wouldn't unless you have some real compelling reason that you need. Well, SQL for you don't need SQL for DirSync at all, you can use SQL for ADFS. Is that what you're talking about? I wouldn't use SQL for DirSync, unless you have way bigger directory than 20,000 objects. Are you going to need to worry about the maximum size of that Windows internal database on your Azure Active Directory server? So a couple other comments about that. SQL isn't required less than 100,000 objects. Yeah, have to be much bigger. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly wait until after the migration. That's probably a reasonable bit of advice. I definitely wouldn't do it while you have users that are kind of in that incremental sync. No fancy attribute, all defaults. Okay, this is all talking about the same stuff. You could do it, but an upgrade in the middle of migration. Have to kill the stage sync, yeah. After setting up hybrid, completing a migration to Office 365, is it possible supported to switch all identity management responsibility to Office 365 and decommission the on-premises Exchange server? So yes, it absolutely is possible. If that's what you want to do, you certainly can. Of course, then you're not going to have your on-premises Active Directory as a source of authority. But yes, that certainly is possible. The on-premises Exchange server, as long as you're using any form of directory sync, you kind of need to maintain an on-premises Exchange server so that you can modify those, like the SMTP address attribute, in your user accounts. That on-premises Exchange server, though, doesn't really have to be set up. It certainly doesn't have to be a hybrid server. You don't have to go through the whole hybrid configuration. It can really be just a basic installed Exchange server. You don't need much more than just installing Exchange. So it isn't really as tough to manage as people think. Upgrade, worry about acquisition after. Sounds like a recommendation. Yeah. Yeah. So you definitely need that Exchange on-prem if you have directory sync. That's the only option that Microsoft supports for modifying those, like your SMTP address, any of those attributes in Active Directory, is Exchange. That's Microsoft's tool for modifying Exchange attributes in Active Directory, is Exchange. So to be supported, you have to maintain that Exchange server on premises as long as you have directory sync running. If you don't have directory sync running, then you don't need that Exchange server. Yeah, you can use ADSI edit to modify those attributes, but that is not supported. Microsoft won't support that. So if you screw something up using ADSI edit, you are on your own. It is certainly not a good option. Any other questions anybody else has? You only get EMS with on-premises Exchange, correct? You mean the Exchange Management Shell? Well, no. You can remote PowerShell into Exchange Management Shell, essentially the same thing, in Office 365. So no, you can get that PowerShell in Office 365. There's a slide deck available. I believe Gabby will make this slide deck available to everybody, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
The slide deck will be emailed out later this week.
Okay, so there you go. When am I coming back to Denver? I have no idea. I was in Denver a couple weeks ago. I think I spoke at some group, Adams, CU, yeah. Oh, Mike wants to know too. Yeah, I don't know, Mike, when I'm coming back to Denver, but good times. But still, let's see. At Kelly, correct. Thanks. Can HA ADFS be implemented with Azure Active Directory and on-premises Active Directory. Not sure what you're getting at there, Todd. Anytime you're using directory sync, you have on-premises Active Directory and Azure Active Directory both. So anytime you're using DirSync, you're using Azure Active Directory and on-premises Active Directory. So AADFS certainly can be implemented there. How come DirSync doesn't support the ampersand character? Azure Active Directory doesn't support the ampersand character. It's not that DirSync doesn't. DirSync could sync it just fine. It's just it isn't allowed in Azure Active Directory, and I have no idea why it's not allowed in Azure Active Directory. But it's not, so don't use it. What I'm saying, one ADFS pair on-prem and one ADFS pair in Azure Active Directory with geoload. So yeah, you can absolutely do ADFS across Azure, not really Azure Active Directory, but Azure. You can deploy Azure ADFS servers in Azure and then join them to a farm that has ADFS servers on premises. Absolutely. You absolutely can do that. Or you have email addresses with the ampersand sign in them. Oh well, yeah, pretty much. Oh well, no, yeah, you can't have the ADFS. And yes, Todd, it's not really cost effective to do that and be supported again with those Azure SLAs. You couldn't just support a pair of servers in ADFS. You would have to set up that load balancing, and it's not cost effective. Correct. Just a couple more minutes here till the top of the hour. Do we have any more questions we want to address? Not ADFS proxy, then VPN is required. Correct. Yes, you'd have to set up VPN if you want to use the ADFS proxy. Yep, it's a load. Not something I'd recommend configuration. If you're going to put ADFS servers in Azure, then I don't see a whole lot of reason to have ADFS servers on premises at all. All right, well, if that's everything, ladies and gentlemen, then we're going to wrap this up. I want to thank eNow